In a landmark decision, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that Boise can't ticket unhoused people for sleeping outside if there's no space in local shelters. So why are police officers still ticketing homeless people? Today on CityCast Boise, we're breaking down how advocates say the Boise Police Department is getting around this ban. Plus, we find out how a new Supreme Court case could change the law. It's Wednesday, April 24th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Rachel Spacek with the Idaho Statesman is here to break down her recent reporting on homelessness. Thank you so much for being here, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
You recently reported on how the Boise police are ticketing homeless people for camping. And this was really surprising to me because there was a ruling in a case from 2019 where the Ninth Circuit Court said that cities couldn't punish homeless people for sleeping outside when there wasn't adequate shelter space available. So can you explain the current laws regarding police ticketing people in Boise who are navigating homelessness?
Yeah, so after that ruling, it became illegal for police to ticket individuals sleeping on the street if there were no beds available in Boise shelters. And just so everyone knows, our shelters right now are Interfaith and Boise Rescue Mission. Interfaith is really low barrier. Boise Rescue Mission, you have to meet some certain standards and you have to be separated from men and women. So there are certain barriers to that one, but an interfaith is often full, as we know. That's why they're moving spots. Mm-hmm. I've heard that that's, something that does happen a lot. The shelters are often full. So if they are, the police can't ticket someone for sleeping on the street, like just for that violation.
Okay, so if there's space in a shelter, then it's illegal to camp outside. But if there isn't space in the shelter, people are still getting tickets? What's going on there?
Yeah, so what I found from obviously talking to homeless people and talking to advocates and people who work in shelters, people are still getting ticketed if they're sleeping outside and there is no space, but they're not necessarily getting ticketed for sleeping. They're getting ticketed for other things. One man I talked to for the story got ticketed for setting up a tent because you can't construct a structure in the parks. So certain things like that, like police are kind of getting away with ticketing people for things that are not exactly sleeping on the streets.
Interesting. So it's not necessarily about them sleeping outside. They're kind of finding these alternative things to ticket people for, like setting up a structure.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a couple other things that I've heard mostly from Jody Peterson, who works at Interfaith. She mentioned a couple of other things that people are ticketed for. Some of those are disorderly conduct, open containers, consuming alcohol in public places, camping in public places, having glass containers in parks. You can also get a ticket for smoking on the Greenbelt. That's something that a couple of the guys I talked to who are homeless and have gotten tickets told me that they've gotten ticketed for. So it's little things like that. But, they definitely add up, especially if you don't have a house.
And you mentioned that there are different barriers of entry for the shelters we have in this area that, people have to meet before they can stay there. Do you know, is that being taken into consideration when homeless people are being ticketed?
So when I talked to Boise police for this story, I know that they work a lot with Interfaith, which is the low barrier, and they also, correspond with Boise Rescue Mission. But I think if, for example, Boise Rescue Mission has beds available, but someone doesn't want to meet that criteria for getting in, they can still get a ticket, even though they don't necessarily want to meet those standards, but because there is a bed available, they would get a ticket.
Interesting. I've noticed recently that there has been more discussion and misconceptions, and I would even say some fear-mongering about the growing homeless population in our area. So what can you tell us about this community?
Yeah, it's a really tight-knit community. For this story, I talked to two guys who We're friends who both during the day hang out at the day shelter at Corpus Christi, which is along Americana Boulevard near like the river exit from the freeway. And lots of people hang out there. They're playing board games, they're talking, they're drinking coffee. And a lot of them also hang out outside of the Corpus Christi like patio along Cooper Court. So it's a really tight-knit community. Lots of people know each other. They are really close with the staff members at Interfaith and Corpus Christi and Catch. They all kind of know everyone's names. And so I would say the community down there, at least in my experience, is really tight-knit. I think they all feel pretty safe together. And they're all really frustrated that they say they get tickets sometimes for just being a homeless person in the area.
I can imagine that is really frustrating. Michael Young is one of the people that you talk to in your reporting about what's going on. And he's one of the individuals experiencing homelessness who has had encounters with the police. And what has his experience been within the system? What did he tell you?
Yeah, so he has been homeless for 2 years now. He spends most of his nights sleeping outside, sleeping along the Boise River off the Greenbelt. He told me he spent about a year on the Greenbelt, like kind of tucked away on the river. He said, he kind of interacted with the community, but it was obviously always in a positive way. But one day he wanted to put up a tent, because he was having a particularly rough day. He wanted a shelter to sleep in. And he said he woke up the next day and had a ticket for having the tent up. And he was really frustrated by that because he says he was never bothering anyone. He doesn't think anyone ever had complaints about him being there. So he was really frustrated with that particular instance, but he has had instances with the police a lot. He said he used to sleep in a car with a partner, and he said that was really hard because in your car you have to move every 72 hours. And he said that sometimes police would give him tickets or warnings before the 72 hours were up. And he said, wherever you go, the police are kind of watching you. And, he described it as harassment at some points. He said that especially police officers on bicycles who patrol the Cooper Court area that I just described around Corpus Christi, they said they kind of do laps and try to ticket people for, whatever misdemeanor or violation they might be doing in that particular moment. And, they really feel like they're kind of overly policed down there.
In all of your investigating and talking to people in this community, what is the impact of getting these tickets or facing charges on people that are in such a vulnerable position?
Yeah, so I talked to David DeRoyne. He used to be a public defender in the Ada County Public Defender's Office, and now he works for Rest Collective, which is a nonprofit law firm. But he basically really laid out kind of the impacts and what happens to people who get tickets or get, fines for misdemeanors. So some of the things like the smoking on the Greenbelt that I mentioned is just an infraction. It's city code that you can't. So it's punishable by a $25 fine. And you do have to appear in court if you are charged with an infraction. But of course, a lot of homeless people, don't have access to their court date, don't have access to getting transportation down to the courthouse. So most of the time they don't appear in court, and then a judge enters a default judgment and there's a $90 penalty. And, most often a homeless person doesn't pay and it goes to collections. But in that case, you don't have any jail time. You don't get arrested. You're in the system and, eventually you might have to pay that fine. But, those are, maybe the best case scenario. It's sad, but just having the fees are in this story kind of the best thing that you can hope. Because if you get a misdemeanor, and that includes the trespassing, camping, disorderly conduct, those are punishable by 6 months in jail or $1,000 fine. And
Oh, wow.
if someone does not appear in court for their trespassing charge, then the judge issues a warrant for failure to appear, which is another charge. And then if you have a failure to appear warrant, you can get arrested the next time the police interact with you. And you will spend a night in jail if it's on a Friday because they don't have court until Monday. You can spend the weekend in jail. So DeRoyne told me that it's often a revolving door because people who have one trespassing charge, might go back to the Cooper Court area where they have community and police will get them again on another charge. So he said it's really a revolving door. So people might not spend that much time in jail, but they'll be back even the next week. That's what he said.
Yeah, it sounds like people who are navigating homelessness really have a lot of extra hurdles or barriers that really complicate existing, but then also navigating the legal system.
Yeah, definitely. And, kind of what I mentioned, even if a lawyer thinks that a person who's unhoused has a case, they just don't want to deal with it because I have a quote in this story that I think was really kind of described what these people are going through. It's like when you're worried about where you're going to get your next meal or where you're spending your next night, you're not worried about your court appearance 6 weeks from now. So there are just much greater things in your life if you are unhoused that come before, okay, well, this attorney thinks that I can get this charge waived, but, I want to know where I'm going to eat tonight. So things like that, it's just like an added stress. And then, it kind of takes a toll on the system too, because if people aren't fighting things that might be, done incorrectly to them, does that just kind of perpetuate this whole cycle that we're seeing in this story?
Rachel, I don't think it's going to be a controversial take to say that it's basically a universal human experience that people have to sleep every night. And lawyers for the homeless population have argued that it's cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited under the Eighth Amendment, to ticket someone or charge them criminally or civilly for sleeping in a public place when they have nowhere to go. So in the case that went to the Ninth Circuit Court, what did the lawyers argue as a reason for ticketing and charging people who are homeless?
They say that it's for public health reasons, for the health of the community and the person, that they have a place to stay and are not sleeping outside. A lot of communities that are dealing with much larger issues of homelessness, like Los Angeles or some other cities in California, say that that's kind of the only way that they're able to regulate where people are sleeping. And, if they aren't happy with a spot that a particular homeless group is sleeping at, they can give them tickets and force them to move. So it's really kind of just a control tactic, ways to kind of put the homeless people where you want them. And, some argue that it's for public health. But that was basically what Boise was arguing in the court.
And with the increase in people navigating homelessness in our area, is there enough shelter space for everyone to stay at a shelter every night?
I have heard from advocates, and they say that there is not enough space. We are often hearing about interfaith in particular being full, or, having to somehow squeeze extra beds in where beds don't belong. So the short answer is no. We don't have an adequate amount of shelter beds. And then with the cost of living, people aren't necessarily leaving homelessness. People don't see a path out of homelessness and into a house. So they're kind of stuck. And, if you get a shelter bed, great. If not, you do end up getting stuck on the street. So Interfaith is moving to a new shelter that will have added capacity, but it's not clear if that, will solve the problem. I think we will still see people who are needing to sleep on the street because they don't have adequate shelter beds.
What has Boise police response been to your reporting on this issue?
Yeah, so they mostly didn't want to talk because I couldn't bring specific cases to talk to them about, and they didn't want to talk generally. And in a statement or two that the spokesperson for Boise Police said, they say that they try to work really closely with shelters and try to get to know the community that they are policing. Jody Peterson said that she does hear from Boise police a lot. She does feel like they are responsive to any concerns that they might have. But she says that that doesn't really address the fact that they are still ticketing homeless people for what she says is just being homeless. So, they say in the statements, they say that they're working with the community and with the shelters, but it doesn't, appear that way when you talk to people who are on the ground and dealing with the police every day.
What about city officials like Mayor McLean? What's her approach to this question of ticketing?
So Mayor McLean came into office while we were getting a ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals against the city of Boise. And the Supreme Court ended up siding with the Court of Appeals. So that's why we are where we are now. But she has also taken a softer approach on ticketing homeless people than Dave Beater, her predecessor, who was really in favor of the city's right to ticket homeless people. I think it's kind of a complicated topic. She does talk about homelessness and especially affordable housing a lot. Unfortunately, a lot of the housing that we've seen come online in Boise is affordable to a certain group of people, but not necessarily affordable to someone who is homeless right now. And the police are still, as I've learned from this story, still ticketing people under McLean's leadership. So I think, it's kind of an interesting thing that she has to navigate.
And one reason we wanted to talk about this now is because there is a case that the Supreme Court heard this week that could potentially overrule the Boise decision. So the Boise decision was that police can't ticket homeless people for being homeless. And potentially with this case, that could reverse that decision. What would that mean for the homeless population of Boise?
Yeah, so what the Supreme Court is hearing now is a case from Grants Pass, Oregon, this small town in Oregon, and the city there was ticketing people for sleeping outside by ticketing them for using certain materials for sleeping. So a pillow, a sleeping bag, a piece of cardboard. And that was kind of how that city was getting around the Boise ruling by, writing tickets for certain sleeping items. And so the Supreme Court is hearing that now, and it is really worrying for Boise homeless advocates in Boise, because, they worry that if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the city, that would largely kind of negate the Boise case, because then you could ticket people for using items if they're sleeping outside, which if you're sleeping outside, you probably have a blanket or a pillow, some kind of item to sleep. And so that would open up Boise unhoused population to getting ticketed for using blankets and pillows, which I think a lot of people who sleep outside do use. So I think Boise is watching the Grants Pass Supreme Court case really closely, because I think it would have a lot of implications for how we treat homelessness now in Boise. And we could kind of go back to how it was before the Supreme Court ruling in the Boise case.
Rachel, was there anything else you found while investigating that was surprising or interesting, or that people should really know about this issue?
It was really interesting, and I think really important for this story to talk to actual homeless people about what they're experiencing, because from their end, they may have been loitering in a place where they shouldn't have, but from their perspective, they feel like they are getting issued these tickets because they are homeless. They see other people who are housed doing similar things or, acting in certain ways, and they feel like they are being targeted because they're homeless. And I think that is an important thing to try to understand from the perspective of being someone who has a house, who's comfortable. In my life, hearing someone say they feel like they're getting these tickets because of how they've, been forced to live their lives is really eye-opening, and I think important to think about when we think about homelessness in Boise and, how to address it going forward.
I agree. Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate you coming and telling us all about this and all about the things that you learned and the perspectives that you gathered. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, we would love it if you'd leave us a review. We'll be back tomorrow morning with a birthday month surprise episode. Catch you then.